to welcome Kashmir today as our final presenter. Kashmir is a lecturer in English for academic purposes at the University of Leeds in the UK, where she teaches on programs for postgraduate research students, pre-sessional courses such as engineering and education, and a language in context sustainability module. Kashmir is also the staff sustainability architect for the School of Languages, Cultures and Societies, and leads an English language course for foreign language assistants who are based in schools around Yorkshire. Her scholarship interests intersect student identity, engagement and internationalisation, including aspects such as critical EAP, criticality in higher education, audio formative feedback and self-directed learning. So at that point, I'll hand you over to Kashmir for today's presentation.
Thank you very much, Simon, and welcome to everyone. I hope you're not too disappointed or will not be too disappointed with this talk, and hope you're all going to be engaged with it. So if you bear with me for one moment, I will share my screen. It's really exciting to see so many of you from all the different parts of the world. So I'll say again, once again, welcome. So my talk is going to be on criticality, and it's linked to my continuing research on criticality and my experience of teaching criticality in higher education. But before I start my talk, I'd like you to take part in a little activity, and it's responding to a question called, what is your understanding of criticality, critical thinking? So if you have your mobile phone handy, point your camera of your phone to the QR code or type in www.menti.com and the code 3588356, or you can use the URL at the bottom, and you will get the question, what is your understanding of criticality, critical thinking, and 3 boxes. And in the box, you write down your response to that. You can put in a phrase or a word in each of the boxes and then submit. Criticality and critical thinking is an opaque concept which is quite complex and slippery to define. So I think it will be interesting to see what my colleagues from all over the world, what your understanding is of these terms. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share the screen and go to this word cloud and see if we have any responses. Wow, I am absolutely amazed, got so many. So it looks like that analyzing, reflection, analysis, questioning are the ones that are getting the most response. Amazing. Reasoning, thinking out of the box, evaluation, reflection, problem solving. Interesting. So I'm going to, if time, we're going to come back to this. And yes, now moving back to my talk, she'll come back to that. It's just that a variety of terminology is used when, talking about critical thinking, criticality, such as critical thought, critique, critical pedagogy, amongst others. So I'm going to start by, my talk is divided into 3 sections. The first part I'm going to talk about is terminology. So let's see if this links to your understanding that you very kindly contributed to the word cloud. So thank you very much for that. And then the second part of my talk is about my experience of teaching criticality in higher education. And the final section is some takeaways. The question usually posed is, what is criticality in higher education? I suggest this needs to be reconsidered to what is criticality in higher education. Why, you may ask? Well, I'll come to that shortly. Critical thinking has no one definition. Literature shows there are many definitions and multiple perspectives arising from varying traditions. For example, Brookfield asserts there are 5 intellectual traditions that inform critical thinking. One influential, well, one of the most influential traditions is the analytic philosophy and logic, a process by which students become more skillful in constructing and deconstructing arguments. The reasons they give for their opinions, conclusions, and statements are judged to be more or less valid according to the evidence adduced in support of them. Another tradition is the natural sciences. This tradition is of hypothesis formulation and testing, which is considered the apex of scientific reasoning, emphasizing the importance of observation and evidence gathering. If analytic philosophy and logic and natural science are from the European tradition, then pragmatism is from the American tradition. The pragmatic orientation, as Cornel West asserts, as indicated in Brookfield, constantly questions tacit assumptions of earlier interpretations. It scrutinizes the norms these interpretations endorse, the solutions they offer, and the self-images they foster. Of the 3 traditions mentioned thus far, pragmatism is the one that has a more authentic feel, as it leads to decisions that influence everyday life. Pragmatism is generally the dominant tradition in play in undergraduate curricula. Critical thinking helping students to make better, more informed decisions. When a tutor asks students to think critically about the link between their everyday experiences and assumptions, they are drawing on the pragmatic tradition. When students consult each other for perspectives that have been missed in an analysis of a situation, they are acting as pragmatists. The next tradition is the psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. This is generally the less influential than the 3 I've just mentioned. It is considered a tradition informing critical thinking because it argues that through critical analysis of our experiences, we can identify assumptions we hold that are preventing us from realizing our inner potentialities. And the 5th, Brookfield asserts that informs critical thinking is critical theory, is the tradition that informs critical thinking that is the most overtly political. Teaching critical thinking informed by this tradition entails students to develop a structural worldview in which the individual troubles are always analysed as political phenomena. However, Davis and Barnett identify 3 pedagogical approaches. The first, logic and argumentation, where clear and rigorous thinking is in a very similar vein to Brookfield's. The place of critical thinking in higher education on one level is development of skills, such as skills in argumentation and skills in making sound judgments. Employers want evidence of critical thinking, but without disposition to use critical thinking skills, then there is not much use of critical thinking. The critical skills and the critical disposition is about the development of the individual and the way they interact with the world. Davis and Barnett also consider the critical pedagogy approach. And this approach considers social institutions, society's actions, not just individuals' actions, to be a vital part of critical thinking. It's more about changing societies, widening the notion of critical thinking even further. Though there are tensions between perspectives, they are not entirely separate. Boundaries are permeable. Critical thinking is taking informed action based on thought and analysis. It is not just about surviving, but thriving and a way to live a much more meaningful life. And Brookfield goes on to add, critical thinking is more than an academic skill, it's a way of living. Now, moving on to when and how to teach critical thinking. There is much literature on whether to teach critical thinking as a generic skill. Is it generalizable, or whether to teach it in a specific context? Is it directly related to a specific subject or specific subjects, or are they cross-disciplinary or other cross-disciplinary aspects? Well, the preliminary data I've collected for my scholarship on this subject from colleagues thus far appears to reflect the literature. There are various understandings and interpretations. Different audiences, such as epistemic communities and disciplines, have their own forms of criticality. For example, a historian's way of viewing criticality will be different from a biologist, and even in the same school, as I learned, differences may occur. My view is that there are elements that could be taught generically, so students have an understanding of the concept of criticality, critical thinking, but equally it is important to have a specific context too. Generalizable critical thinking is a useful foundation, but not a substitute. Criticality differs according to the ontology and epistemology of each discipline. Now moving on to critical thinking and EAP. To teach critical thinking in English for academic purposes, Bruce advocates consideration is required of one's understanding of English for academic purposes and EAP's overall goals. He suggests one of the key areas of knowledge that EAP is concerned with is academic discourse competence, excuse me, which include subject epistemology, assignment genre, processing and creating extended text, textual grammar, including elements such as cohesion and coherence, academic lexis, and meta discourse devices, a top-down syllabus with a holistic objectives on genre and text types. One element is evaluative judgment, that is critical thinking as articulated in text. Bruce asserts EAP needs to concentrate on ways to identify and express these evaluative judgments. Students need to become familiar with discursive knowledge, text and textual resources employed as This would assist students to develop their ability to interact with and create evaluative judgments in academic texts. You may have noticed that I've been using the terminology criticality and critical thinking without any distinction between them. Now I'm going to speak of criticality that suggests a specific meaning. In education, discourse criticality is often synonymous with critical thinking, which is viewing criticality in a fairly limited way. As Barnett asserts, criticality is so much more. It needs to widen from just ticking the critical thinking box. So it's not just about embracing capacities to think critically, but it is also to understand oneself critically and to act critically and become a critical being, that is a critical person who is not subject to the world, but able to act autonomously and with purpose within it. So viewing criticality not just as critical thinking, but a way of being, acting, and engaging. Critical individuals engage with knowledge, with themselves, as well as the world. So criticality is related to the three domains: knowledge, self, and world. Critical reason is directed to formal knowledge, critical self-reflection directed to the self, and critical action is directed to the world. So, criticality is distinct from critical thinking, but it encompasses critical thinking. The concept of criticality involves students reflecting on their knowledge and simultaneously developing their critical thinking, their critical self-reflection, and critical action. So criticality is widening critical thinking. It's not only argument, judgment, reflection. It's also about widening the individual's identity and the individual's participation in the world. So at this stage, I would like to go back to the word cloud, and if you just bear with me one moment, if I can see it, yep. And I just want you to take a moment and have a look at the word cloud and see if you can see any distinctions or between critical thinking and what I've just said about criticality that involves critical self-reflection and critical action. Because as I said, when talking about critical thinking, various terminology is used, but now I've just explained or suggested a difference between criticality and critical thinking. Just a moment for you to think about that. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to my talk. One second, yes. And now I'm going to move on to the second part of my talk, which is my experiences of teaching criticality in higher education. Generally, the students I'm connecting with are international pre-sessional postgraduate and postgraduate research students. And criticality is one of the main challenges students from diverse educational, cultural, and linguistic backgrounds and traditions experience during their studies. Research has shown that international students' approach to an understanding of criticality can adversely impact their academic performance. However, it's not just international students. Literature also shows that students who are L1 speakers of English also find it difficult to demonstrate criticality, particularly in their reading and writing. So to engage criticality, there needs to be a disposition and opportunities to develop this. Students need to be exposed to situations, environments where opportunity is given to develop dispositions to engage with criticality or critical thinking. So my take on teaching criticality, it has been to embed it in each lesson by teaching it implicitly through the Socratic way of questioning students and not accepting the students' short initial response. I press students to provide a deeper response by requiring them to develop their reply by continuously asking questions such as why, how, how do you know, justify, what about the other perspective, have you considered this, have you considered that. Initially, this approach confuses the student, but simultaneously engages the class. When the student was unable to respond, another student would chip in to expand this, and this usually resulted in more students taking part in the discussion. The outcome suggests students were demonstrating criticality. However, despite students demonstrating criticality in the class by use of Vygotsky's concept of scaffolding, it was not being evidenced in the students' reading or writing. So this led me to teach criticality explicitly by using models such as Bloom's taxonomy, even though the models fall short as they don't encompass criticality to its full sense as indicated by Davis and Barnett. So what I say to the students is, don't passively accept the models, and I ask them to view the models with a critical eye. And I also ask them questions such as, how useful have they found them in helping them to understand the concept of criticality, critical thinking, and if models have any shortcomings. The students found the Bloom's taxonomy, too general, but could see elements that they could apply to, and to have a pictorial image that showed evaluation at the apex of the pyramid structure, stressed the emphasis that they need to give to evaluation in their reading and writing. I also use another model from my colleagues in skills at library at my institution. And here the students found the questions prompts helpful and found this model more accessible than Bloom's. However, they thought that too much weight was being given to description, particularly when tutors' feedback generally indicated less description and more analysis and evaluation. So the students adopted the model whereby description has less emphasis than evaluation and analysis. Even though I use models in my lessons to introduce criticality, I think they should be handled cautiously, as students may see them as definitive ways to develop their criticality skills. So I highlight that the students need to view the models critically. For example, the question prompts here, as indicated here, are not necessarily solely for the categories that are shown here. And also, if you check search on the internet, you will find various versions of Bloom's taxonomy, where the hierarchy of the pyramid has a slightly different order, and the processes for analysis and evaluation are explained with different words, using different verbs than the ones in the model I've just shown you. The generic element of criticality can take place with activities such as the ones I'm going to just share with you, whereby the students use the critical model to look at statements in a systematic way. So students become confident with the concept and start to question statements and claims and see them from different perspectives. Criticality is also a social practice. So I get students to work in groups on a platform such as Padlet. I think I'm going to just share this with you if it works. If I can see it. Oh yes, here we are. And show you, because this, as I said, criticality is also a social process, a social practice. So students working in pairs or in small groups can add their responses to the question, eating 5 portions of fruit and vegetables a day is essential to maintain a healthy lifestyle. And then after students have responded, other groups can then also comment and interact with the responses the students have given. And it's also interesting to me as a tutor, the students having said less weight to description, are they giving less weight to description in their responses here? But excuse me. Moving back to my talk, let's see. Yep. After starting off with these fairly straightforward activities, can move on to activities that are a little bit more sophisticated, such as text analysis, such as advocated by Bruce, with subject-specific context and genre-based pedagogy, and recognize and creating evaluative judgment. So Bruce is saying that text analysis requires a genre-based pedagogy that promotes a deep level of engagement with text and their discursive meanings. So it is looking at not just the criticality of it, but also the subject-specific vocabulary, and also, you know, the writer's positioning in relation to the audience, where it, and, you know, kind of analyze the text to locate where the writer is being descriptive, critical, and then descriptive and critical of previous research, and how does the writer show criticality. And this is where you can point out evaluative judgments, enabling students to recognize these and also being able to express them. If you recall, criticality also embeds critical action. So one concrete example influenced by Barnett's critical EAP, where the classroom is seen not as a neutral space, but a space for transformation, I'd like to share is an activity from my Language in Context Sustainability module. After having deconstructed the concept of sustainability and looked at case studies, I linked sustainability to a real-world problem and the university's 2023 plastic-free campaign. That is, the university's commitment to eradicate single-use plastic throughout the university by 2023. So taking this as a springboard, the students were asked to consider and research the plastic policies of places where they consumed goods, whether it be a supermarket, a grocery store, a coffee shop, or a fashion store. So what the students did was research the use of plastic and the plastic policies of these stores, these companies, and then write a formal communication with respect to their plastic policies, and then follow up with a response. And this activity can also be followed up by discussing it in a seminar discussion. So the actual critical action has taken place by writing a formal communication, receiving a response, and then following up on that response, because the students initially were surprised they did get a response, and some of the students were a little bit taken aback because the response some of them got were the generic response a company writes about a particular topic without actually responding to the students' questions. So the students, this particular group of students, took a little bit of umbrage. So they then followed up to the person who had responded to say that their question hadn't been answered, so they would like a response to their question. So this started off a dialogue between that company and the students. And the overall exercise, what the students found was that they do have a voice, and a voice that is listened to, and that they could also be agents of change. So I want to add here that, as Barnett asserts, criticality is modern thinking. It involves action. However, action doesn't necessarily have to be concrete. It can be action, if only in the sense that the expression of a critical thought is a definite intervention in the world, and it involves the self. The development of a critical thought brings about the development of self. Now, going to go on to the final part of my talk, which is takeaways. So the takeaways. So yes, engage with criticality and not, so I'm inviting you here, this huge audience from all over the world. I am inviting you to engage with criticality, not just as critical thinking. So to continue this conversation, consider highlighting all aspects of criticality. That's not just critical thinking, but critical self-reflection and critical action in the classroom. So consider highlighting all aspects of criticality. Use blended learning techniques and models. Encourage and engage students with critical self-reflection. I suggest critical self-reflection is not something that's just added on or bolted on, but it needs to have a key space in the lesson or in the curricula. And maybe one of the ways you could possibly consider is at the beginning of each lesson, students could critically self-reflect from previous sessions, or at the end of the lesson, you know, critically self-reflect on what they've learned in that particular lesson. What I'm trying to say here is you need a key space for this, not just something as an ad hoc element to a lesson. And before I finish, I would like to say, to introduce a thing that my colleagues my colleagues at Skills at Library have developed a MOOC on Future Learn called Critical Thinking at University, an Introduction. If I can just show you this, it will only take a moment. here. Yeah. Critical thinking at university, an introduction. This is really aimed at undergraduate students, but I find that my postgraduate students have found this useful because it also introduces students to criticality in different epistemologies, for example, maths, linguistics, history, geography. And the couple of the examples that I've used, that I've shared with you today are examples from here. So you as colleagues may find this as a useful source to take, use the examples here that you could develop or adapt for your classes as well. Now just returning to my talk. Yes, that's the end. So thank you very much for listening. And I am more than happy to take any questions. So thank you very much.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Kashmir. Enormous amount of people here, actually. So, and a number of questions. So that's excellent. Thank you very much.
Shall I stop sharing? Then I can.
That's yeah. If you want to just stop sharing the screen, as long as we can see you and hear you still, that's okay. Fantastic. Yeah. Let's just kick off with something here. I mean, there's obviously different levels of students and different types of institutions. People are from everywhere, and maybe people don't or haven't yet introduced critical thinking into their classrooms, into their lessons. So how do you start by sort of introducing critical thinking into students' works? Because there was a couple of questions on this and ways of implementing critical thinking into my lessons.
Okay.
For the first timers really that haven't done this.
Because I think sometimes if you use the terminology critical thinking, critiquing, criticality, sometimes that might kind of overwhelm or kind of not in the students might think that they don't know what this is. So I would suggest by asking a little bit like I said about the Socratic way, questioning. Maybe the questions don't have to be quite deep, but you kind of start asking one or two questions, and as the students respond, you peel away the layers and kind of get the students to think a little bit more deeply about the response that they've given, instead of just spontaneously giving the response. Or if they have, you kind of go back and interrogate that response. Then slowly, you could say, well, that is looking at something with a critical eye. Or you could even use everyday examples in the students' personal lives. For example, when you go out and buy a pair of shoes or a handbag or some consumer good, or you would consider your budget, you would consider the materials that it's made from, the value, the quality. So that was also looking at something with a critical eye. So you could, start at a much easier, accessible level before you move on to something, at a deeper level. Yeah.
I was smiling because I was just thinking of a sort of 4-year-old child. Why?
Yes, exactly. Because that's what it is. Because my students say to me, because they will give me, bear in mind these are postgraduate students, they will give me an answer and I will say, okay, why? And then they'll add a little bit, and then I'll say, okay, why? And then they'll add a little bit more. And then sometimes they get flummoxed, they kind of get hesitated, but that way you do get others. My experience has shown you get others joining.
I think it's natural to help other people out as well, but also they're having a different thought on that subject. No, that's great. I suppose they get used to that quite quickly, that okay, she's not just going to accept this. I really have to think about this. So it's a good way to train.
Exactly. After about a couple of lessons, they realize that it is going to go deeper. And you're right, it is a bit like Pavlov's dog. As soon as they know, it has to go a bit deeper.
I suppose that keeps them alert as well. They can't just sit there. They have to be thinking, oh, I'm going to be asked a question, I'm going to be asked why. So they're constantly having to think. Good question here. I like this one. What is the secret behind your interest in criticality?
Secret. Oh, I'm so curious. I am absolutely curious. I am so curious about everything. And I think it's experience, because what I learned when I was an undergraduate student at university, I learned that you don't have to accept what teachers tell you. You can question. That was a real eye-opener for me when I was doing my undergraduate studies at university. So since then, yeah, I like interrogating. I like to get behind the question. Yes, I think you need to have curiosity about the world. You know, what kind of world do you want to live in? Other people who are making decisions for you, are you happy with the way that so and so? You know, the times that we're living, it's yeah, very, very difficult. So
Yeah,
yes,
no, sure.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody mentioned that as well, saying it's a life skill. You know, we need to start questioning things with life in life generally. You know, social media. Look at, you know, different things that are happening around the world. I don't want to name anything specific, but you know that we have to really sort of think critically more now as
Definitely.
people with more social media around.
Yeah, particularly the generations that are coming up. You know, you need to be very aware and have social literacy about what you need to accept as a fact and what you need to realize is an opinion, and if you know what kind of evidence is being used, and the way language is used to persuade you to think one thing. You need to, yeah.
I'm sure there's loads of people just desperate to have a microphone and join in this conversation, and I'm very sorry you can't, but we can see the comments. But let's keep going with another one. Any books or literature or anything that you recommend that would maybe start you off perhaps into critical thinking?
If you're interested, the one that I found very accessible, because it's written in a way like a conversation in some parts, and it's Stephen Brookfield. It's a reference on my slides. Yes. I first came across him when I was an undergraduate student, but the book that I've been referring to specifically for this presentation that's influenced me is his book that he wrote in 2012. Yes, Stephen Brookfield. And criticality as a concept that I've been introducing to you today, Davis and Barnett, their 2015. Again, that's on my reference list. Yes.
Thanks very much. Let's pick another one here. I think we've got a little bit of time. Could you give an instance of how I can use criticality, if I can say that, in an English classroom?
In an English classroom. Oh, classroom.
Just
okay.
In a class, how can I use criticality with my
you
students?
could use it, for example. Why not use the local newspaper or a national newspaper, and you could go to a section or a story that the students are interested. It could be a sports story, it could be any, you know, current affairs, and analyze a passage, a section, you know, highlight where they're using factual information, highlight where it's opinion, what evidence are they using to support the claim that they're making. Are they using any evidence? Yeah. So you can start off by using journalistic articles, or even a magazine article.
Sure. Or two different,
and that way you can also look
newspaper.
at it from different genres as well. You know, compare it to an academic genre, an academic journal.
Sure.
Because sometimes I find some students think that The Economist and The New Scientist are academic journals, when the audience is a completely different audience to somebody who's looking at the Journal of Engineering, Civil Engineering or Construction, completely different audiences. So again, to see how they are using language. And I just want to mention that Ian Bruce, because I went to one of his plenary talks at a conference in the summer, and he's come up with with ways to look at criticality or critical thinking in EAP. So I would recommend his book as well. Sorry, I meant to say that earlier. Yes.
Don't worry if you can't catch this, because you can watch this again.
Yes.
This is all recorded, so people can go back and listen to the references. There was a question, a quick one. I think we've got time, but I'm interested in this. So, what is the difference between deep and surface learning? I think a couple of people have asked that.
Okay, there's theory behind this as well. Surface learning, to put simply, is where you are just looking at everything on a superficial way. You're just accepting things that are said to you. A deep learning is where you are already looking at something that somebody has said, or something that you are reading, with questions that you are already trying to figure out what's the agenda behind this, what's the purpose of this. Yes, that's very simply
That's
put.
a good, that's a nice definition there.
Yeah.
I think we've just got time for one more. If you're marking students' work with, in a critical thinking way, is there a framework, or how do you manage to analyze the work and mark that work?
Okay, we have criteria, assessment criteria, and in that assessment criteria, it tells you that you need to have evaluation, you need to have analysis, and students can demonstrate this in a variety of ways. And one way, it could be argued that the sources that the student has used in order to do this particular task is also being critical, because of the sources that they have used. But then it could be me marking this, it could be that maybe there's some aspects are missing, and the sources that this student has used hasn't really looked at it from all perspectives, or it hasn't looked at the methodologies. So that could be, one area that you could, when you're giving feedback to the students, you say that you need to refer to a wider source. But generally we do have, we mark to a criteria. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. Fantastic. I think, I'm really sorry, everybody, but that is all we have time for. And a huge thanks to Kashmir for that talk. I think we had a record number of people this time.